Okay, well, welcome to this very brief lecture and review on sentence voice. It's one of those things we talk about in all kinds of other areas when we talk about emphasis or focus or the given new, or indeed, if we talk about register, we talk about things being in the passive voice, for instance. So tonight, what I want to do in this brief lecture is basically talk a little bit about what it means to have sentences in different voices. But first, some trivia. We've been talking about all kinds of difficulties in English. Here's a classic example of some of the difficulties in the orthography and pronunciation of English. And in this case, we're talking about the letters O-U-G-H. And evidently, there are essentially 9 ways to pronounce those letters, O-U-G-H, in English. Although, as I'll point out, to be fair, in Canadian and British English, there's only 8 ways. And here's the really ridiculous sentence. A rough-looking, dough-faced, thoughtful plowman strode through the Scarborough streets, but after falling into a slough, he coughed and hiccuped. Now, isn't that great? Isn't that a great set of words that show you just how weird the orthography of English is? Evidently, that red word, slough, which rhymes with plow or plowman, in American is a slough. So he doesn't fall into a slough, he falls into a slough. And there you go. So, yeah, we're going to talk a little bit tonight. I'm going to do a quick recap on emphasis and focus in the given new. I'm going to give you an example of where that's really important. We're going to come back to that again and again and again in terms of particularly technical communication in the next course and in the follow-on courses. It's so critically important to provide context for people to understand technology quickly that we really can't overemphasize the importance of following the given new and indeed of creating well-focused, coherent text. And again, I want to really talk about the active and the passive voice tonight, and that's really, really super important. Okay. So we talked last time in the last lecture about the articles which are available to you on the course website, the Viral Superhighway, Too Close in this year of 2020, and All Systems Go. But it's also important in general technology use to understand how the given new works and just how important it is. So look, here's at random a Python programming language quick reference guide. And do you see the importance of the given new here? Even if you don't understand any of this, which you might not, you can understand from the way the orthography works and the graphics work on this card, how you're supposed to read this, and what the given information is and what the new information is. I'm not saying this is good, by the way. In fact, it's pretty horrible in all kinds of ways. Information's squished. It's not very graphically sophisticated, and we're going to talk about that in the next lecture. But the given new is still, you can tease this out, right? So clearly this is about Python, the programming language. If you didn't know there was one called Python, now you do. That's context. It's obviously about computers and working with Python and using Python. These headlines here are clearly important. They're pretty vague, which makes them bad. I mean, there's no point really providing vague context to people. That's kind of a dumb thing to do. Nevertheless, importing modules, naming conventions, reserved keywords, comments, writing code basics, all of those things as you go through the card at a glance, at a high level, are the important things that actually give you the context for what comes next. Again, that's true of the subheadings too. So if it says many available libraries, the next sentences you expect to read are about the readily available plurality of libraries for Python programming language. Okay? Don't worry if you don't understand this. By the way, if you don't understand this, it's probably because everything here is new, right? Everything here is new to you. If you're not a programmer, you don't know what scope and indentation means. You don't know what reserved keywords are, and you don't know what a variable is as opposed to a constant or a function, right? Or how they work. So I just use this to show you that this is so important in learning and in understanding how language works. And it's not just for business communication, but it's also for technical communication, academic communication, all kinds of communication. It's a core thing to understand to be a good writer. Okay, back to PowerPoint. Okay, so tonight we have to talk about the passive voice and emphasis and what happens, right? So I know you guys know this, or maybe you don't. But if I ask you what the difference is between the active and the passive, it's about how the sentence is constructed. It doesn't really have to do with the past or present, okay? I know lots of people who think it does, smart people, and there is a component of it in the way the passive is constructed. But the passive is not the past, necessarily, and the active is not the present, necessarily, okay? They are different constructions according to where the emphasis in the sentence is cast, okay? So in an active sentence, that's the simplest form of sentences in English, okay? And they essentially follow the format of subject, verb, object. Remember this? Right? So look, the subject performs an action and it's expressed by a verb, the action itself. And you know who the agent or the actor is. So look at this sentence. The dog bit the boy. Okay. Whoops. The dog bit the boy. Okay. The dog bit the boy. It could be the boy bit the dog. Either way, it is an active sentence because you know who is biting and who is bit. Okay? The dog is the actor and the action is biting and the object of that action is the boy. Okay, if we turn this into passive, the subject, which in which case receives an action, and the agent or actor is secondary or completely unknown. So the boy was bitten, right? You could just say that. The boy was bitten. And you don't say by the dog, or you could say by the dog. But the fact is, the agent here, the dog doing the biting, has been shifted around. Now, remember what we were saying about emphasis and how English has end focus? So in these kinds of sentences, you are changing the topic of the sentence. In the dog bit the boy, the topic of the sentence is the dog, the subject, right? In the passive, the boy was bitten, the subject of the sentence is the boy. You've just changed the focus or the emphasis of that sentence just by rearranging the words a little bit. Okay? The most important thing to understand, though, is the passive doesn't talk about direct action. It's indirect. And because it's indirect, it has all kinds of effects that you probably don't want 99% of the time. Okay? The other thing to note is that, yes, the passive is actually constructed by a past participle and a past form of the verb to be. So whenever you see the verb to be, is, was, any of the forms of the verb to be, followed by a past participle, right? You know you're in passive territory and not active territory, right? The dog bit the boy, that's still in the past tense, right? The dog bit the boy yesterday. The boy was bitten, right, is also in the past tense. But one is active and one is passive. Okay, so when do you use the active voice in business writing versus the passive writing? And I very rarely give you guidance on terms of what's right and what's wrong. But just like cliches and avoiding them, the guidance on when to use the active voice in business is very strong. It's as often as possible with some exceptions. Now, that means you should be writing in the active voice 99% of the time. Okay? I would also say you should be writing in the active voice 99% of the time for academic writing, in the humanities especially, but there's a lot of professors who would disagree with me. Nevertheless, in business, it's definitely as often as possible with some exceptions. What are those exceptions? Okay. So you use the passive voice in business writing as infrequently as possible But when you don't know the agent or the agent is unimportant, in other words, when you don't want to blame someone for something, you can use the passive. So imagine this sentence. We were robbed. Okay, so who robbed you? Does it matter? Do you know even? Maybe you don't know. So we were robbed is a perfectly legitimate passive sentence, right? It's perfectly okay to say we were robbed, right? Even if you know the person who made a mistake, say in business, like that poor guy who ordered too many envelopes in that exercise I gave you, it's much, much better to say, 2,000 extra envelopes were ordered, right? It's even better, actually, to say, we ordered 2,000 extra envelopes without mentioning the poor person that did it. But if you don't really know the agent or the agent is unimportant, you can change the focus to the action that happened in the passive voice. And that's okay. Sometimes style demands it, right? Sometimes, particularly in scientific experiments, and if you're, doing scientific experiments or writing them up, you would probably use the passive voice. Some professors will make you use the passive voice for essay writing. But mainly it's the sciences or the social sciences who need the passive voice. Why is that, do you think? Well, the reason is because the person doing the experiment, the experimenters, are not important. The whole point of scientific writing is to show that it can be done by anyone, right? So an experiment can be carried out and reproduced by anyone. The experimenters themselves are not important. They're not important to the data. They're not important to the outcome, right? Are they important in terms of publishing? Yes, they are. But the structure of scientific writing sort of demands the passive voice. There's legal processes that also demand the passive voice, right? So when style demands it, you write it in the passive. Finally, there are some overly complex sentences in English that have to do with emotion and states of being, and it's really hard to write them in the active voice. So here's a double passive, right? Or here's a passive that's hard to write actively. It astounded me that he was prepared to go to the Himalayas. Okay, now that he was prepared to go to the Himalayas is passive. So you could write around it and say, he prepared to go to the Himalayas and I was astonished. Although I was astonished is still passive, right? So as he prepared to go to the Himalayas, I felt astonished. Okay, that's pretty awkward. It's not the same thing as it astounded me that he was prepared to go to the Himalayas. That's actually one of the few exceptions where you have those kind of complex sentences that only really make sense colloquially in the passive. But there's something else that the passive voice does, right? It does hide the agent. It does shift the focus. And it does raise the formality of the sentence. And usually it raises it much too much. So here's some examples. And normally if we were in a classroom, I'd ask you to, just tell me, is this active or passive? So here we go. A distinction is made by theologians between consubstantiation and transubstantiation. There's that word again from the last lecture. Is that active or passive? Well, I hope you said it is passive because the distinction is made. There's the verb form of to be, is, and made, the past participle of to make. So a distinction is made by theologians between consubstantiation and transubstantiation. If you're going to make that active, all you'd have to do is say what? Theologians make a distinction between consubstantiation and transubstantiation. Users make many critical errors on computer systems, active or passive. Active, because users make the errors, right? And that's fine. If you said many critical errors on computer systems were made by users, that would be passive. And you could actually leave out the by users at the end, just like the dog in the earlier example. We were robbed. Well, I already told you this one, right? We were robbed is actually a passive sentence is a perfectly good passive sentence, especially if you don't know who did the robbing. It's the only way you could say it, right? Unless you said, an anonymous person robbed us, or a man robbed us, or a woman robbed us, etc., etc. Your scholarship application has been lost. Now, you see how Weasley the passive can guess? If you hide the agent of an action, you also avert blame. So your scholarship application has been lost. If you made that active, it would have to be, we lost your scholarship application, or someone lost your scholarship application. And immediately the subject of the sentence is the person doing the losing, and not the fact that the scholarship application is indeed lost. It is agreed that we will meet next Tuesday. Active or passive? Passive, because is agreed is passive, right? It's agreed that we'll meet next Tuesday. You can change that to active just by saying, we agree to meet next Tuesday, or let's meet next Tuesday. Both of those are active voice. Okay. The concert hall will be completed next spring. The concert hall will be completed next spring. What is that? Passive again. Doesn't tell you who's doing the completing. Doesn't say the workmen will complete the concert hall next spring, or the city will complete the concert hall, or, it doesn't tell you any agency at all. Okay? The construction workers will complete the concert hall next spring. After examining the data, it was concluded that the stock should be purchased. That's about as passive as it gets, folks. It was concluded that the stock should be purchased, not after examining the data, we concluded that we should purchase the stock, which would be active. Okay, so I hope this very, very quick active and passive review has helped you here. Here's a final one. The conclusions in our report are based upon solid evidence from the Wall Street Journal. Is that active or passive? Boy, it kind of sounds active, doesn't it? But it isn't. It's passive, because are based is passive. The conclusions in our report are based upon solid evidence from the Wall Street Journal can be active by saying, we based our conclusions on solid evidence from the Wall Street Journal. See how every time it becomes active, you know who's doing the action, right? So again, I hope this helped you. If you have any questions about this or anything else, you can always email me, or indeed ask questions in the eClass question survey category. Okay? All right. The next lecture's on graphics. I'll have that posted very soon. And send me questions if you've got them. And remember, always use the active voice unless you have a very, very good reason to use the passive voice. Okay.